A billionaire offered a humble waitress $10,000 to leave and never come back. But her fearless response made the entire room erupt in applause and exposed a dark secret that would shatter his empire. Subscribe now, or this might be our last meeting. Follow, comment, and share to stay connected. Don't miss out. Let's dive in. Autumn painted the windows of Hazel's Corner Cafe with golden light. The leaves outside danced in the cold Boston wind, swirling and falling like memories that refused to stay buried. Inside the small cafe, warmth embraced everyone who walked through the door. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with cinnamon rolls filled the air. It was the kind of place that felt like home. Simple, honest, and full of heart. Nora moved between the tables with the calm of someone who had already seen chaos and survived it. She was 31 years old, but her eyes carried the weight of someone much older. Her hands were steady as she poured coffee. Her smile was gentle but guarded. She spoke softly to the customers, never too much, never too little, just enough to make them feel welcome. Behind the counter, Hazel Moore wiped down the espresso machine with slow, careful movements. She was 65, with silver hair tied back in a loose bun and kind eyes that had seen too much loss. Hazel owned this cafe. It was her life, her sanctuary, her gift to the neighborhood. She looked at Nora with the tenderness of a mother watching over a wounded child. "Peace is the luxury of those who have lost much," Hazel said quietly, almost to herself. Nora glanced at her and smiled sadly. She understood those words better than anyone. Peace wasn't something you found easily. It was something you earned through pain, through loss, through letting go of the life you thought you deserved. That morning, the cafe was unusually crowded. Men in expensive suits filled nearly every table. Their voices were low and serious. Their eyes were cold, calculating. These were not the usual customers. These were businessmen, investors, people who measured the world in dollars and power. Nora felt the shift in the atmosphere immediately. The warmth of the cafe seemed to dim under the weight of their presence. She moved carefully, refilling cups, clearing plates, staying invisible. That's what she had learned to do, stay invisible. It was safer that way. Then he walked in. Grant Weller was impossible to miss. He was 43 years old, tall and commanding, with sharp features and an air of absolute authority. His suit was perfectly tailored. His watch gleamed on his wrist. Everything about him screamed wealth and power. He didn't walk into the cafe. He entered it like he owned it, like he owned everything. Behind him came a group of men, all just as polished, all just as cold, but none of them had the presence that Grant had. He was the center, the sun they all orbited around, and he knew it. Nora watched him from across the room. Her heart didn't race. Her hands didn't shake. She had seen powerful men before. She had worked for them. She had been destroyed by them. Power didn't impress her anymore. It only made her sad. Grant sat down at the largest table, right in the center of the cafe. His group surrounded him like a wall. Nora approached with a tray of coffee cups, her face neutral, her voice polite. "Good morning. Can I get you anything else?" Grant barely looked at her. "Just keep the coffee coming." Nora nodded and turned away. She felt the weight of his presence, but she didn't bow to it. She refused to. Not anymore. At the table, Charles Denton sat beside Grant with a smug smile on his face. Charles was 56, with slicked back hair and cold, calculating eyes. He was Grant's business partner, but more than that, he was the kind of man who enjoyed making others feel small. He treated waiters like they were nothing, like they were dust beneath his expensive shoes. Eli Turner, the young waiter, was nervous. He was only 29, with an honest face and hopeful eyes. He loved working at Hazel's. It was his safe place, his chance to build something good. But right now, with all these powerful men staring at him, he felt terrified. He approached the table carefully, holding a tray with water glasses. His hands were shaking just a little. He tried to steady them, but the fear was too strong. And then it happened. The glass slipped. It fell from the tray and shattered on the floor with a loud, terrible crash. The entire cafe went silent. Eli froze. His face went pale. His heart pounded in his chest like a drum. He looked down at the broken glass, then up at the men at the table. Charles Denton's face turned red with fury. "Incompetent!" Charles shouted, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "You're fired! Get out of here right now!" Eli's eyes filled with tears. He opened his mouth to apologize, but no words came out. He felt humiliated, destroyed. This job was everything to him, and now it was gone. Just like that, because of one mistake. The room stayed frozen. Everyone stared. No one moved, no one spoke, except Nora. She took a deep breath. Her heart was calm. Her mind was clear. She had been silent for too long in her life. She had let powerful men crush her once before. She would not let it happen again. Not to Eli, not to anyone. She stepped forward. "No one gets fired over a dropped glass, sir," she said firmly. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried across the entire cafe. Every eye turned to her. Charles stared at her with disbelief. Grant looked up, his gaze sharp and piercing. The silence was thick, heavy, electric. Nora stood tall. She didn't look away. She didn't apologize. She simply stood there, calm and unshaken, like a rock in the middle of a storm. And in that moment, everything changed. The destiny of everyone in that cafe, Nora, Grant, Charles, Eli, Hazel, it all began right there, in that silence, in that single moment of courage. Grant Weller lifted his eyes and looked at Nora with cold intensity. He was not used to being challenged, ever. People bent to his will. They agreed with him. They obeyed him. That's how the world worked. That's how his world had always worked. But this woman, this simple waitress, she didn't bend. She didn't flinch. She stood there, looking him straight in the eyes, as if she had every right to speak, as if she were his equal. It bothered him, more than he wanted to admit. "How much does courage like that cost?" he muttered, his voice low and irritated. Nora smiled softly. There was no arrogance in her smile, no mockery, just truth. "You can't pay for what's free, sir," she said calmly. Grant felt something stir inside him. Anger, yes, but also something else. Something he couldn't name. His pride reacted before his mind could catch up. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a leather checkbook. His movements were quick, sharp. He clicked his pen and scribbled on the check with firm strokes. Then he ripped it out and held it up in the air. $10,000, he said coldly. "Leave now, and never come back." The room gasped. $10,000. It was more money than most people in that cafe made in months, maybe even a year. It was an insult and an offer all at once. A way to make her disappear. A way to silence her. Charles smirked. The other investors shifted uncomfortably. Hazel's hands froze over the counter. Eli stared with wide, terrified eyes. But Nora didn't move. She looked at the check in Grant's hand. She looked at it for a long moment, as if considering it, and then she looked back at him. Her face was calm. Her eyes were clear. She had seen worse things than this. Much worse. "Mr. Weller," she said, her voice steady and strong. "What destroys a business isn't the person who serves the coffee. It's the person who sells their conscience." The words hit like thunder. Grant's hand froze in the air. His face went pale. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. He felt like he had been struck across the face, not with a hand, but with truth. Hazel lowered her head, tears welling in her eyes. She was so proud of Nora, so deeply, achingly proud. And then, something incredible happened. One of the investors stood up. He began to clap. Slowly at first, then louder. Then another investor stood, and another. Soon the entire table of powerful, wealthy men was on their feet, applauding. The sound filled the cafe like rain after a drought. The other customers joined in. Even the people passing by outside stopped and looked through the windows, sensing something important had just happened. Nora stood in the center of it all, surrounded by applause, but she didn't smile triumphantly. She didn't raise her hands in victory. She simply stood there, humble and dignified, as if this moment wasn't about her at all. Grant remained frozen in his seat. The check was still in his hand, forgotten. His mind was spinning. His heart was pounding. He felt something he hadn't felt in years, maybe ever. Shame. Deep, burning, undeniable shame. This woman, this stranger, had just done what no boardroom full of executives, no competitor, no rival had ever done. She had made him feel small, not with cruelty, not with power, but with simple, honest truth. Charles grabbed Grant's arm and hissed, "Let's go, now." But Grant didn't move. He couldn't. He was stuck in that moment, replaying her words over and over in his mind. What destroys a business isn't the person who serves the coffee, it's the person who sells their conscience. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Grant stood. He didn't look at Nora. He couldn't. He walked toward the door in silence, his face expressionless, his mind a storm. The applause faded as he left. The investors followed him out, murmuring among themselves. Charles threw one last venomous look at Nora before disappearing through the door. And then the cafe was quiet again. But it wasn't the same quiet as before. This was the quiet after a battle, after something had changed forever. After the applause died down, Nora turned and walked back to the counter. Her legs felt heavy. Her heart was pounding now, even though she had seemed so calm. She picked up a dishcloth and started wiping down the espresso machine, just like nothing had happened. But everything had happened. Outside, Grant Weller climbed into his black car without saying a word. His driver started the engine, but Grant didn't tell him where to go. He just sat there, staring out the window, his mind racing. The check was still in his hand. $10,000. Unsigned. Useless. He crumpled it slowly and let it fall to the floor of the car. Charles sat beside him, furious. "That woman is dangerous," he muttered. From the front seat, one of the investors turned around. His face was thoughtful. "Or maybe she's just too honest for our world." Charles glared at him, but said nothing. Inside the cafe, Hazel came around the counter and gently took Nora's hand. Her touch was warm, motherly, full of love. "You shouldn't have done that," Hazel whispered, her voice shaking. Nora looked at her with sad, tired eyes. "I couldn't stay silent, Hazel. I've been silent before. I won't do it again." Hazel squeezed her hand tighter, tears rolling down her cheeks. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. They both knew what silence had cost Nora in the past. Eli stood nearby, his eyes filled with pure admiration. He looked at Nora like she was a hero, like she had just saved his life, and maybe she had. "Thank you," he whispered. Nora smiled gently. "You did nothing wrong, Eli. Don't ever let anyone make you feel like you did." Outside, the autumn leaves continued to fall, dancing across the wet pavement. The wind was cold, but inside the cafe there was warmth again. Slowly, the customers returned to their conversations. Life went on, but Nora couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. She reached into her apron pocket and felt the small, worn badge hidden there. She pulled it out just slightly, enough to see the faded letters. Nora Ellison, Economics Department, Weller and Denton. Her past was rushing back like a cold wind. She had tried so hard to bury it, to forget it, to become someone new. But the past never stayed buried. It always found a way back. She looked out the window at the falling leaves and whispered to herself, "The piece is over." Hazel heard her and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Maybe," she said softly. "Or maybe the real piece is just beginning." Nora didn't answer. She just closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The storm had started, and she knew, deep in her heart, that it was only going to get stronger. Grant Weller spent the entire day replaying the scene in his mind, over and over, like a film stuck on repeat. He sat in his massive corner office on the 43rd floor, surrounded by glass walls and a view of the entire city, but he couldn't focus on anything. Not the contracts on his desk, not the emails flooding his inbox, not the phone calls from investors wanting updates. All he could hear was her voice. What destroys a business isn't the person who serves the coffee. It's the person who sells their conscience. The words echoed in his head like a sentence from a judge, a verdict he couldn't escape. They cut deeper than any insult, any accusation, any betrayal he had ever faced in business, because they were true, and he knew it. Grant rubbed his temples and stared out the window. The city sparkled below him, buildings, lights, money, power. He had built an empire. He owned half the real estate in Boston. People feared him, respected him, obeyed him. But that woman, that simple waitress in an apron, she hadn't feared him at all, and that terrified him. Charles Denton walked into the office without knocking, as he always did. He poured himself a drink from the bar in the corner and smirked. "Still thinking about her?" he asked, mockingly. Grant didn't answer. Charles laughed and took a long sip of whiskey. "Don't be impressed by a woman in an apron, Grant. She's nobody. A waitress. Probably didn't even finish college." Grant turned slowly and looked at Charles with cold, hard eyes. "She reminded me of my father." The smirk disappeared from Charles's face. He froze, the glass halfway to his lips. Grant's father was a subject they never discussed, ever. The old man had been honest to a fault, too honest for business, Charles always said. He had died poor, refusing to compromise his principles even when it cost him everything. Grant had sworn he would never be like his father. He would never be weak, never be poor, never let morals get in the way of success. But now, sitting in his office full of wealth and power, he felt more like his father than ever before, and it shook him to his core. Charles forced a laugh, trying to lighten the mood. "Your father was a good man, Grant, but he was a fool. You're not a fool. Don't let some waitress make you forget that." But inside, Charles felt fear creeping up his spine. He knew something Grant didn't know yet. He knew that the name Nora wasn't new. He had heard it before, years ago, and if Grant ever remembered where he'd heard it, if he ever connected the dots, everything would fall apart. Charles drained his glass and set it down hard on the desk. "Forget her. She's nothing." But Grant couldn't forget her. He tried. He buried himself in work. He attended meetings. He reviewed contracts. He signed papers. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face. Calm, steady, unafraid. Who was she? That evening, Grant did something he hadn't done in years. He left the office early. He got into his car and told his driver to take him back to Hazel's Corner Cafe. When they arrived, the cafe was closed. The lights were off. The chairs were stacked on the tables. The closed sign hung in the window. Grant stepped out of the car and stood on the sidewalk, staring at the darkened cafe. His reflection stared back at him from the glass, a man in an expensive suit, alone on an empty street, looking for answers he didn't know how to find. "Who are you, Nora?" he whispered to himself. The wind blew cold through the street, scattering leaves around his feet. He stood there for a long time, hands in his pockets, just staring. For the first time in his life, Grant Weller didn't want to win. He didn't want to conquer or control or dominate. He just wanted to understand, and that terrified him more than anything. Because the man of stone, the man who had built walls around his heart for decades, was beginning to crack, and once those cracks started, there was no stopping them. In her small room above the cafe, Nora sat at a tiny wooden desk, writing in a worn journal by the light of a single lamp. The room was simple, just a bed, a dresser, a chair, and a window that looked out over the quiet street below. But it was hers. It was safe, and that was all she needed. She wrote slowly, carefully, letting her thoughts flow onto the page. Writing helped her process things, helped her breathe when the world felt too heavy. On top of the dresser, beside the lamp, lay an old newspaper clipping. The paper was yellowed and fragile, folded and unfolded so many times that the creases were starting to tear. The headline was bold and damning. "Economist exposes billion-dollar fraud at Weller and Denton." Below the headline was a photograph of a younger Nora. Her hair was longer then. Her face was softer, less guarded. But her eyes carried the same quiet strength they still held today. Except back then, they also carried hope. Hope that the truth would matter. Hope that people would listen. Hope that justice would win. Nora stared at the clipping for a long moment, then whispered to herself, "No one believed me." The words were barely audible, but they carried the weight of years. Years of pain. Years of being called a liar. Years of watching her career crumble. Her reputation destroyed. Her life torn apart. All because she had dared to tell the truth. She had been an economist. A good one. Rising fast in the company. People respected her. Admired her. She had a future. And then she found the fraud. Millions of dollars. Hidden accounts. Fake transactions. All designed to line the pockets of the executives while investors lost everything. It was massive. Criminal. Unforgivable. So she reported it. And they destroyed her for it. They called her unstable. Jealous. A disgruntled employee seeking attention. They produced fake evidence. They discredited her research. They turned everyone against her. And in the end, no one believed her. Not the lawyers, not the media, not even her own colleagues. She lost her job, her reputation, her name, everything. So she disappeared, changed her name, started over in a small cafe where no one knew who she used to be. A soft knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Come in," Nora said quietly. The door opened and Hazel stepped inside, carrying 2 steaming mugs of tea. She set one down on the desk beside Nora and sat on the edge of the bed, her kind eyes full of understanding. "The past doesn't erase, Nora," Hazel said gently, "but it can be forgiven." Nora shook her head, tears threatening to spill. I'm not ready for that, Hazel. Hazel took a slow sip of her tea, then looked at Nora with that maternal gaze that always made her feel safe. Maybe you're not, she said softly, but maybe he is. Nora froze. She looked up sharply. What do you mean? I saw his face today, Hazel said. When you spoke to him. He wasn't angry, Nora. He was broken. Nora turned away, staring out the window into the dark night. The steam from her tea rose between them like a veil. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the mug. She didn't want revenge. She truly didn't. She just wanted peace, a quiet life, a place where the past couldn't reach her anymore. But destiny rarely asked for permission. Outside, the wind howled softly, sounding almost like voices calling from a distant memory. Nora closed her eyes and let the tears finally fall, silent, hot, and full of years of buried pain. Hazel stood, placed a gentle hand on Nora's shoulder, and kissed the top of her head. Then she left quietly, closing the door behind her, and Nora sat alone in the lamplight, surrounded by the ghosts of everything she had lost. 2 days later, Grant Weller walked back into Hazel's corner cafe. The moment he stepped through the door, the entire cafe changed. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Coffee cups paused halfway to lips. Every eye turned toward him. He looked different than before. His suit was still expensive, his presence still commanding, but there was something softer about him now. Something humbled. His shoulders weren't as straight, his jaw wasn't as tight. He looked like a man carrying the weight of his own mistakes. Grant walked slowly toward the counter, his hands clasped in front of him like a schoolboy about to apologize to a teacher. Nora was wiping down the espresso machine. She saw him coming but didn't stop working. She stayed calm, steady. He stopped in front of the counter and cleared his throat. I came to apologize, he said quietly. The cafe was so silent, you could hear the clock ticking on the wall. Nora set down her cloth and looked at him directly. Her gaze was firm, but not angry. There was no hatred in her eyes, just truth. You didn't offend me, Mr. Weller, she said evenly. You offended yourself. Grant flinched, as if she had slapped him. He looked down at the counter, unable to meet her eyes. He felt exposed, naked, vulnerable in a way he hadn't felt since he was a child. Hazel appeared from the back room, her face carefully neutral, though her eyes were full of emotion. She poured 2 cups of coffee, one for Nora, one for Grant, and set them on the counter without a word. Grant picked up his cup but didn't drink. He just held it, letting the warmth seep into his hands. Can I at least know the name? He asked softly. Of the woman who disarmed me. Nora hesitated. For a moment she considered lying, giving him a fake name, keeping the wall between them intact. But she was tired of hiding, tired of running, tired of being someone she wasn't. So she told him the truth. Nora Ellison. Grant's hand jerked. The coffee cup rattled against the saucer. His face went pale. His eyes widened in shock and recognition. The name hit him like a knife slicing through time. Nora Ellison. He knew that name. He had buried it, forgotten it, convinced himself it didn't matter. But now it was back, staring him in the face, demanding to be remembered. The past, his past, her past, their shared past, rose up from the table like a ghost that refused to stay buried. And for the first time in years, Grant Weller understood exactly what he had done. Grant returned to the office with no color in his face. His driver had asked him twice if he was feeling well, but Grant hadn't answered. He couldn't. His mind was spinning too fast. His heart was pounding too hard. The name echoed in his head like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. Nora Ellison. Nora Ellison. Nora Ellison. He burst through the doors of Weller and Denton like a man possessed. His assistant stood up quickly, startled by the look on his face. Mr. Weller, are you... Where's Charles? Grant demanded, his voice sharp and cold. He's in his office, but... Grant didn't wait for her to finish. He strode down the hallway with long, angry steps, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Employees scattered out of his way, sensing the storm brewing inside him. He reached Charles's office and threw the door open without knocking. Charles was sitting behind his desk, sipping scotch and reviewing contracts. He looked up with mild irritation, then saw Grant's face and froze. Nora Ellison, Grant said, his voice low and dangerous. That's impossible. She disappeared. Charles set down his glass carefully, his expression shifting into something carefully neutral. But there was a flicker of something else, something guilty, that passed across his face, and Grant saw it. Disappeared? Charles repeated slowly, as if testing the word. Yes, she did. Years ago. Why are you? She's back, Grant interrupted, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. She's been here, in Boston, this whole time, working as a waitress in a cafe. Charles's eyes widened. For a split second, genuine shock crossed his face. But then it was gone, replaced by that smooth, practiced composure he always wore like armor. Well, Charles said lightly, forcing a chuckle. What are the odds? Small world, isn't it? But his hand trembled slightly as he reached for his glass, and there was sweat. Unmistakable sweat, beginning to bead on his forehead. Grant stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. You told me she was destroyed, Charles. You guaranteed it. Charles swallowed hard and tried to smile. And she was, Grant. Look at her. She's serving coffee. She lost everything. Career gone. Reputation ruined. No one in the industry would touch her with a 10-foot pole. I'd say that's pretty thoroughly destroyed, wouldn't you? Until now, Grant said coldly. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Charles shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He picked up his glass again and took a long drink, buying himself time to think. She can't prove anything, he said finally. Not anymore. It's been too long. The evidence is gone. The witnesses are gone. She's nobody, Grant. A ghost from the past. Let her stay buried. But Grant wasn't listening anymore. Something was clicking into place in his mind. Pieces of a puzzle he had ignored for years were suddenly fitting together. He took another step forward, looming over Charles's desk. What did you do to her? Grant asked quietly. Too quietly. Charles looked up at him, and for the first time there was real fear in his eyes. He opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. I did what needed to be done. What did you do? Grant's voice rose now, filling the office like thunder. Charles stood abruptly, slamming his hands on the desk. I saved the company, he shouted. She was going to destroy us. She found the accounts, Grant. The offshore transfers. The fake transactions. All of it. If she had gone public, we would have lost everything. Everything. So yes, I stopped her. I discredited her. I made sure no one would believe a word she said. And you know what? You didn't want to know the price. You never wanted to know. You just wanted the problem to go away. And I made it go away. The silence that followed was deafening. Grant stared at Charles as if seeing him for the first time. His partner, his friend, the man he had trusted for 15 years. And suddenly, Grant understood. Nora Ellison hadn't been lying. She had been telling the truth. And he, had destroyed her for it. The fraud had been real. The corruption had been real. And they had built their entire fortune on top of her ruin. Grant felt like the floor had disappeared beneath his feet. His stomach twisted, his chest tightened. He stumbled backward and sank into the chair behind him, his legs suddenly unable to hold him up. My God, he whispered. What have we done? Charles straightened his tie and tried to regain his composure. We survived, Grant. That's what we did. We survived. But Grant wasn't listening. He was staring at the wall, his mind racing through every memory, every decision, every moment he had chosen to look the other way. He had signed off on deals without reading them. He had trusted Charles to handle the details. He had convinced himself that if he didn't ask questions, he wasn't responsible for the answers. But he was responsible. He had always been responsible. The truth was a shattered mirror lying at his feet. And for the first time in his life, Grant Weller looked down and saw his own reflection among the broken pieces. He saw a man who had traded his integrity for wealth, a man who had chosen comfort over courage, a man who had destroyed an innocent woman's life because it was easier than facing the truth. And what he saw, what he truly saw, filled him with deep, crushing shame. He stood slowly, his face pale, his hands shaking. He looked at Charles one last time, really looked at him, and realized he was looking at everything he had allowed himself to become. Get out, Grant said quietly. Charles blinked. What? Get out of my office. Get out of this building. You're done. Charles laughed nervously. Grant, you can't be serious. We're partners. We built this company together. You can't just... Get out! Grant roared, his voice breaking. The door burst open and 2 security guards appeared, summoned by the shouting. Grant pointed at Charles. Escort Mr. Denton out of the building, immediately, and call our lawyers. I want every deal, every contract, every transaction he touched reviewed by morning. Charles's face turned red with fury. "You'll regret this, Grant. You have no idea what you're doing." But Grant had never been more certain of anything in his life. "I know exactly what I'm doing," he said. "I'm finally doing what I should have done years ago." The guards took Charles by the arms and led him out. He shouted threats and curses all the way down the hall, but Grant didn't hear them. He stood alone in the office, surrounded by the wreckage of his own choices, and for the first time in decades, he felt something close to clarity. He had been a coward. He had been complicit. He had been wrong. And now he had to find a way to make it right, even if it cost him everything. Block 8. The weight of truth. Grant didn't go home that night. He couldn't. The walls of his penthouse felt like they were closing in on him, suffocating him with luxury he no longer deserved. Instead, he went back to the office. The empty, silent office where the ghosts of his mistakes waited for him in filing cabinets and locked drawers. He sat at his desk and began pulling files. Old files. Files that hadn't been touched in years. Dusty folders marked with dates from 5, 6, 7 years ago. He opened them one by one, spreading them across his desk like pieces of evidence at a crime scene. And that's exactly what they were. Numbers stared back at him. Transactions that didn't make sense. Transfers to accounts that didn't exist. Signatures, his signature, Charles's signature. Signatures from people who had long since left the company or disappeared entirely. It was all there. Every lie, every manipulation. Every dollar stolen from investors who had trusted them. Grant's hands shook as he turned the pages. His stomach churned, his head pounded. How had he not seen this before? How had he convinced himself it was all legitimate? That Charles was just being creative with the accounting? "Because you didn't want to see it," a voice whispered in his mind. "You wanted the money. You wanted the success. You wanted the power. And you didn't care how you got it." Then he found it. At the bottom of one of the boxes, buried beneath years of forgotten paperwork, was a manila folder marked "Confidential Internal Complaint, Ellison N." Grant's breath caught in his throat. His hands trembled as he opened it. Inside was Nora's original report. 43 pages of meticulous research, carefully documented evidence, and clear, undeniable proof of fraud. She had traced every transaction, identified every fake account, calculated exactly how much money had been stolen and from whom. Her work was flawless, professional, impossible to refute, and clipped to the front page was a memo, signed by Charles, recommending that the complaint be dismissed as baseless accusations from a disgruntled employee seeking attention. But below that, below Charles's signature, was another signature, his own, Grant Weller, approving the dismissal, validating the silence, sealing Nora's fate with a single stroke of his pen. "My God," Grant whispered, his voice breaking. "I was complicit." He had signed it without even reading her report. He had trusted Charles. He had taken the easy path. He had destroyed an innocent woman's life because it was convenient, because it protected his wealth, because he was too much of a coward to face the truth. Grant dropped the papers and covered his face with his hands. He wanted to scream, to cry, to punch the wall until his knuckles bled. But he just sat there, frozen, drowning in shame. He looked up at the window. Dawn was beginning to break over the city, painting the sky in shades of gray and gold. In the reflection of the glass, he saw himself, a man in an expensive suit, sitting in an expensive office, surrounded by expensive things. But the man staring back at him wasn't the man he wanted to be. It was a man who had sold his soul for success, a man who had looked the other way when it mattered most, a man who had hurt people and called it business. Grant hated that man. He stood abruptly, grabbed his coat, and walked out of the office. His driver was asleep in the car downstairs, but Grant didn't wake him. He got into his own car, a vehicle he rarely drove himself anymore, and started the engine. He drove through the empty streets of Boston as the sun slowly rose. The city was just beginning to wake up. A few joggers ran along the sidewalk. A bakery turned on its lights. A street cleaner pushed his cart down the block. Normal people, living normal lives. Lives built on honesty and hard work. Lives that meant something. Grant pulled up in front of Hazel's Corner Cafe just as the first light touched the windows. The closed sign was still hanging on the door, but through the glass he could see movement inside. Nora was there. She was wiping down the tables, moving slowly and methodically, lost in thought. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore jeans and a faded sweater. She looked tired, peaceful, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with appearance and everything to do with the quiet strength she carried like a shield. Grant sat in his car for a long time, just watching her. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He wanted to go in. He needed to go in. But he couldn't move. What could he possibly say to her? How could he ever apologize for what he had done? What words existed that could undo years of pain and injustice? There were none. He knew that. But he also knew he had to try. He reached for the door handle and froze. His courage failed him. His hand dropped back into his lap. He couldn't do it. He wasn't ready. He wasn't. The cafe door opened. Hazel Moore stepped outside, a broom in one hand and a knowing look on her face. She had seen him sitting there. Of course she had. Nothing escaped Hazel's watchful eyes. She walked over to his car and tapped on the window. Grant rolled it down slowly, feeling like a child caught doing something wrong. Hazel looked at him with those wise, penetrating eyes. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She just looked at him, really looked at him, and saw everything he was trying to hide. Either come in to change, she said quietly, or leave to forget. The words hit Grant like a hammer. Simple, direct, true. He could turn the car around right now, drive away, go back to his life of wealth and power and comfortable lies, pretend none of this had happened, bury the guilt the way he had buried Nora's complaint all those years ago. Or he could step out of the car, walk through that door, face the woman he had destroyed, and begin the long, painful process of becoming the man he should have been all along. For a moment, just a moment, Grant considered driving away. But then he thought of his father, the good man who had died poor because he refused to compromise his integrity, the man Grant had spent his whole life trying not to be, and Grant realized he didn't want to run anymore. He turned off the engine. He stepped out of the car. He walked toward the cafe door, his legs feeling like lead, his heart pounding in his chest. Hazel held the door open for him, her expression softening just slightly. Grant stepped inside. The cafe smelled like coffee and cinnamon. The morning light streamed through the windows, painting everything in gold. Nora looked up from the table she was cleaning, and their eyes met. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Grant took a deep breath and said the only thing he could say, the only thing that mattered. "Good morning." His voice was quiet, humble, broken, and with those two simple words, his redemption began. Grant sat down at one of the small tables near the window. He wasn't wearing his usual armor today. No tailored suit, no expensive watch, no mask of power and control. He wore a simple sweater and jeans. His hair was disheveled. His face was pale and drawn, lined with exhaustion and regret. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days. Because he hadn't. He looked human, vulnerable, real. Nora stood a few feet away, frozen in place, the cleaning cloth still clutched in her hands. She stared at him, her heart pounding, her mind racing. Part of her wanted to tell him to leave, to walk out that door and never come back. But another part of her, the part that had been carrying the weight of truth for so many years, knew that this moment had been coming all along. Grant looked up at her, and their eyes met. His gaze was raw, unguarded, full of pain that mirrored her own. "I need to talk about what happened years ago," he said quietly. His voice trembled. It wasn't the voice of a billionaire. It wasn't the voice of a man used to commanding rooms full of powerful people. It was the voice of someone broken, someone desperately trying to find the words that might begin to heal what he had shattered. Nora didn't move. She didn't sit down. She just stood there, holding that cloth like a lifeline, her body tense, her breathing shallow. "Then talk," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Grant took a deep breath and began. He told her everything, everything. He told her about the fraud, how Charles had orchestrated it, how the money had been hidden, how the investors had been deceived. He told her about the day her complaint arrived on his desk, how Charles had dismissed it immediately, how he, Grant, had signed off on that dismissal without even reading her report. "I trusted him," Grant said, his voice breaking. "I trusted Charles to handle things. I told myself that if I didn't ask questions, I wasn't responsible. But I was responsible. I was always responsible." He told her about the sleepless nights after she had been fired, the nagging feeling that something wasn't right, the whispers among employees, the way people stopped talking when he walked into a room. But instead of investigating, instead of demanding answers, he had buried himself in work. He had convinced himself that she was just a disgruntled employee, that Charles had handled it properly. "I chose comfort over courage," Grant said, his hands clasped tightly together on the table. "I chose wealth over truth. I chose my empire over your life, and I will never, never forgive myself for that." Nora stood perfectly still, listening to every word. Tears gathered in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Not yet. She had cried enough tears over this man and his company. She had cried herself to sleep for months after they destroyed her. She had cried when no one believed her, when her colleagues turned their backs on her, when her name became a joke in the industry. But she wasn't crying now. Now she was just listening, letting the truth finally be spoken aloud. When Grant finished, the silence in the cafe was absolute. Even the morning sounds outside seemed to fade away. No cars, no birds, no wind. Just silence. Nora set down her cloth carefully on the nearest table. She wrapped her arms around herself as if trying to hold the pieces of herself together. "You destroyed my life," she said finally. Her voice was calm, steady, but the pain underneath those words was vast and deep. It wasn't anger. It wasn't rage. It was just pure, honest pain, the kind that doesn't scream, the kind that lives quietly in your bones and never quite goes away. Grant flinched as if she had struck him. "I know," he whispered. "I lost everything." Nora continued, her voice still eerily calm. "My career, my reputation, my name, my future. People I had known for years crossed the street to avoid me. Colleagues I had mentored refused to return my calls. I became a ghost, a cautionary tale, the woman who lied, the woman who cried wolf, and all of it, was because you were too afraid to look at the truth." "I know," Grant said again, his voice barely audible. "And I want to fix it." Nora laughed, a short, bitter sound that held no humor. "Fix it," she repeated. "Mr. Weller, you can't fix this. Nothing fixes what shame erases. Nothing gives me back the years I lost, the person I was, the life I should have had." Grant looked down at his hands. They were shaking. "I know," he said for the third time. "But please, please let me try. Even if I never succeed, even if it takes the rest of my life, let me try." Behind the counter, Hazel wiped her eyes with the corner of her apron. She was crying quietly, not with sadness, but with something deeper, something almost like hope. She had watched Nora carry this burden for so long, and now, finally, someone was acknowledging the weight of it. Someone was saying the words Nora had needed to hear for years. "I'm sorry. You were right. I was wrong." Eli stood near the kitchen door, watching the scene unfold with wide, believing eyes. He was young. He still had faith that people could change, that wrongs could be righted, that love and truth could win in the end. And as he watched Grant Weller, this powerful, broken man, humbling himself before Nora, Eli felt that faith grow stronger. Maybe, just maybe, there could be a different ending to this story. Nora took a deep, shuddering breath. She closed her eyes for a moment, gathering her strength. When she opened them again, there was something different in her gaze. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the first fragile seed of possibility. "The truth," she said slowly, carefully, "is the only possible beginning, Mr. Weller. Not money, not power, not promises, just truth. Complete, public, undeniable truth." Grant looked up at her, hope flickering in his exhausted eyes. "Then I'll give you the truth," he said. "All of it. I'll expose the fraud. I'll restore your name. I'll tell the world what really happened. I'll do whatever it takes." "Even if it costs you everything?" Nora asked quietly. Grant didn't hesitate. "Especially if it costs me everything." The silence that followed was different from the one before. It wasn't heavy with pain and regret. It was something else, something almost sacred, like the moment between a question and an answer, between darkness and dawn, between the past and the future. It was the silence of two souls standing at a crossroads, deciding which path to take. Hazel bowed her head and whispered a prayer under her breath, a prayer of gratitude, of hope, of faith that somehow, against all odds, healing might actually be possible. Eli smiled softly, his heart full, and Nora looked at this broken man sitting before her and made a choice. Not to forgive, not yet. That would take time, maybe years, maybe forever. but to allow him the chance to try, to speak the truth, to begin again. "Okay," she said simply. "Let's start with the truth." And the silence between them became a prayer, a shared, unspoken prayer, that truth might finally set them both free. 1 week later, Grant Weller sent out an invitation that shocked the entire Boston business community. He was calling an emergency meeting with all major investors, board members, and partners of Weller and Denton. The message was brief and cryptic. A matter of corporate integrity requires immediate attention, but it was the location that made people whisper and wonder. Not the grand conference room on the 43rd floor, not the luxury hotel ballroom where they usually held such gatherings. Hazel's Corner Cafe, the same small, humble cafe where everything had begun. The morning of the meeting, Hazel arrived early. She moved through the cafe with slow, reverent movements, wiping down every table, straightening every chair, polishing every surface until it gleamed. She worked in silence, but there was something almost ceremonial about her actions. She wasn't just cleaning, she was preparing something sacred, a place where truth would finally be spoken, where justice would finally be served, an altar for redemption. Nora arrived an hour before the meeting was scheduled to begin. She wore simple black pants and a white blouse, professional but unpretentious. Her hair was pulled back. Her face was calm, but Hazel could see the tension in her shoulders, the careful way she breathed, the way her hands trembled slightly as she tied her apron. "Are you ready?" Hazel asked gently. Nora looked at her with those steady, honest eyes. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I'm here." Hazel took her hand and squeezed it. "That's all that matters, child. You're here. You're standing. You're not hiding anymore." Nora nodded, blinking back tears. She had spent so many years hiding, running, becoming invisible. But today she would be seen, and that terrified her more than anything. The investors began arriving at 9 o'clock sharp. They came in expensive cars, wearing expensive suits, carrying expensive leather briefcases. They looked around the small cafe with confusion and barely concealed disdain. This wasn't their world. These simple tables, these worn chairs, this smell of coffee and cinnamon, it all felt beneath them. But Grant had insisted, so they came. They sat down at the tables Hazel had arranged in a semicircle, murmuring to each other, checking their watches, wondering what this was all about. And then Charles Denton arrived. He walked in with his head held high, his expression smug and confident. He had no idea what was coming. Grant hadn't told him about the meeting, hadn't warned him. Charles assumed this was just another business gathering, another opportunity to manipulate and control and maintain his power. He saw Nora serving coffee and his lip curled in contempt. That troublesome waitress again. Still here, still insignificant. He had no idea he was looking at his own destruction. Hazel moved between the tables like a silent guardian, filling cups, offering cream and sugar, her face serene, but her eyes watchful. Eli stood near the counter, his heart pounding with anticipation. He had been told what was about to happen, and he truly believed, that today would change everything. At exactly 9:30, Grant Weller stood up. The room fell silent immediately. All eyes turned to him. He looked different than he had a week ago. Older, humbler, but also stronger somehow, like a man who had finally found his spine after years of living without one. "Thank you all for coming," Grant began, his voice steady but not loud. "I know this is an unusual setting for a business meeting, but what I have to say today requires honesty, and honesty doesn't belong in boardrooms anymore. It belongs here, in places like this, where real people live real lives." Some of the investors shifted uncomfortably. Charles frowned, sensing something wrong. Grant took a deep breath. "Years ago," he continued, "this company, our company, committed a grave mistake, a mistake that I was complicit in, a mistake that destroyed an innocent person's life." The room was so quiet you could hear the clock ticking on the wall. "We committed fraud," Grant said simply. "Millions of dollars were stolen from investors, hidden in offshore accounts, falsified in our records. And when someone tried to expose the truth, when someone had the courage to stand up and say, 'This is wrong,' we silenced her." Charles stood up abruptly. "Grant, what are you—" "Sit down," Grant said firmly, his voice rising. "Sit down and let me finish." Charles's face turned red with fury, but he sat. The other investors stared at Grant with wide eyes, some with shock, others with dawning understanding. Grant continued, his voice breaking slightly now. The woman who reported the fraud, the economist who documented everything with meticulous care and absolute accuracy, she was destroyed for telling the truth. We discredited her. We ruined her reputation. We made sure no one would ever believe her. We made her disappear. He paused, his eyes glistening with tears. And then we built our empire on top of her ruin. The room erupted in gasps and whispers. Some investors looked at each other in shock. Others looked at Charles, who was now pale and sweating, his confident mask crumbling. "Today," Grant said, his voice growing stronger, "I am here to ask for forgiveness. Not from you, not from the board, but from her." He turned and looked directly at Nora. She stood near the counter, the coffee pot still in her hand, her face calm but her eyes bright with unshed tears. "This is her," Grant said, his voice full of reverence and regret. "This is Nora Ellison, the economist who tried to save us from ourselves, the woman whose life we destroyed because she refused to be silent, the woman who has been serving coffee in this cafe while we lived in luxury, built on her suffering. The silence that followed was absolute." And then, slowly, reverently, one investor stood up. He looked at Nora with respect and began to clap. Then another stood, and another. Soon the entire room was on their feet, applauding. Not polite applause, not business applause, but real, heartfelt, thunderous applause. The kind that shakes the walls and fills the soul. The kind that says, "We see you. We believe you. We are so, so sorry." Nora stood frozen, tears streaming down her face. Hazel wrapped an arm around her shoulders, crying openly now. Eli clapped until his hands hurt, his face split in a huge, joyful grin. Charles Denton stood slowly. His face was twisted with rage and humiliation. He looked at Grant with pure hatred. Then he looked at Nora with something like fear. Without a word, he turned and walked toward the door. No one stopped him. No one called after him. They just watched as he left the cafe, defeated not by lawyers or lawsuits or corporate battles, but by the simple, devastating power of truth. He stepped out into the autumn morning and disappeared into the shadows he had created. And inside the cafe, the applause continued. For Nora, for courage, for truth, for the possibility that maybe, just maybe, it's never too late to do the right thing. The story spread like wildfire. Within 24 hours, every major news outlet in Boston was covering it. Within 48 hours, it had gone national. The headlines were everywhere. Billionaire confesses, we destroyed her for telling the truth. Waitress was actually whistleblower, vindicated after 7 years. The woman who wouldn't stay silent. Nora Ellison's story of courage. Television crews camped outside Hazel's Corner Cafe. Reporters called constantly, begging for interviews. Social media exploded with support for Nora and condemnation of the corporate corruption she had exposed. Her name, once a punchline, once a cautionary tale, became a symbol of integrity, of courage, of the power of truth. But Nora didn't want fame. She never had. She refused most interview requests. She didn't appear on talk shows or pose for magazine covers. She simply continued working at the cafe, serving coffee with the same calm grace she always had, treating the sudden attention like a storm that would eventually pass. I didn't speak up to become famous, she told the one reporter she agreed to speak with, a young journalist from a local paper who reminded her of herself at that age. I spoke up because it was right, that's all. And I'd do it again, even knowing the cost. Those words, simple and honest, resonated with millions of people who were tired of lies, tired of corruption, tired of watching the powerful escape consequences while the honest suffered. Nora became a hero without ever trying to be one. Grant, meanwhile, worked tirelessly to make things right. He hired a team of forensic accountants to trace every dollar that had been stolen. He contacted every investor who had been defrauded, and then he did something that shocked even his own lawyers. He gave it all back. Every penny of profit that had come from the fraud, millions upon millions of dollars, he returned. Some went back to the investors who had been cheated, but most of it went to charities, organizations that helped whistleblowers, foundations that supported economic justice, programs that gave second chances to people whose lives had been destroyed by corporate greed. He didn't keep a single dollar for himself. His lawyers told him he was insane. His accountants warned him he'd be left with almost nothing. But Grant didn't care. Money had never made him happy. It had only made him comfortable. And comfort, he had learned, was a prison. Back at the cafe, Hazel watched the news coverage with tears in her eyes and a smile on her face. She stood behind the counter one morning, looking at Nora, and said softly, "You know what a miracle is?" Nora looked up from the coffee she was pouring. "A miracle," Hazel continued, her voice warm and wise, "is when truth finds courage. When someone decides that doing right is worth more than staying safe. That's what you did, child. You performed a miracle." Nora's eyes filled with tears. She walked around the counter and hugged Hazel tightly. "I couldn't have done it without you," she whispered. "Yes, you could have," Hazel said, holding her close, "but I'm glad you didn't have to." The cafe itself transformed in the weeks that followed. The publicity brought attention, and with it, support. Donations poured in. People wanted to help rebuild the place that had become a symbol of honesty in a dishonest world. Eli received a promotion. Hazel made him manager of the new, expanded Hazel's Corner Cafe. He accepted with tears in his eyes and a promise to honor the values that made the place special. He hired staff carefully, looking not for experience but for character, for kindness, for integrity. "We're not just serving coffee here," he told each new employee. "We're serving hope." And they were. Nora, meanwhile, began receiving invitations to speak. Universities wanted her to talk to business students about ethics. Corporations wanted her to train their employees on integrity. Nonprofits wanted her to inspire their teams about perseverance. At first, she refused them all, but Hazel encouraged her. "Your story doesn't belong to you anymore," the older woman said gently. "It belongs to everyone who needs to hear it, everyone who's been silenced, everyone who's afraid to speak up. You have to share it, Nora. You have to." So she did. Nora began giving talks, small ones at first, to community groups and college classes. She spoke simply and honestly about what had happened, about the cost of telling the truth, about the years of pain and silence, but also about faith, about new beginnings, about the fact that doing right doesn't always lead to immediate reward, but it always leads to peace. Her audiences listened with tears in their eyes and fire in their hearts. She inspired people, changed people, gave them courage to face their own battles with integrity. And through it all, Grant Weller watched from a distance. He came to the cafe sometimes, always alone, always quietly. He sat in the corner and drank coffee and read the paper. He never asked for special treatment, never demanded Nora's attention. He was just there, present, changed. Sometimes they talked, brief conversations about nothing important, the weather, the news, how the cafe was doing. Other times they simply existed in the same space, connected by a shared history neither could escape. Slowly, so slowly neither of them really noticed it happening, something began to grow between them. Not attraction, not yet, but something deeper, something that felt like understanding, like respect, like two wounded souls recognizing each other across a crowded room and realizing they weren't alone anymore. One evening, 6 months after the meeting that had changed everything, Grant came to the cafe just before closing. Nora was wiping down tables. Hazel had gone home. Eli was in the back, counting the register. Grant stood in the doorway for a long moment, just watching her work. Then he stepped inside and cleared his throat softly. Nora looked up and smiled, a real smile, warm and genuine. "Coffee?" she asked. "Actually," Grant said, his voice nervous, "I wanted to ask you something." Nora set down her cloth and gave him her full attention. Grant took a deep breath. "Can I be part of your new beginning?" he asked quietly. "Not as penance, not as payment for what I did, but as someone who wants to know the woman you are now, someone who wants to learn how to be better, someone who—" He stopped, struggling for words. "Someone who would like to walk beside you, if you'll let me." The cafe was silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. Nora looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then a small smile touched her lips. "As long as you come without a check," she said softly. Grant laughed, a real genuine laugh full of relief and joy, and something that felt dangerously close to hope. "No checks," he promised. "Just me, flawed and trying. That's all any of us are," Nora said. They laughed together then, not the polite laughter of strangers, but the tender, knowing laughter of people who had survived something terrible and come out the other side. People who understood that forgiveness wasn't a moment but a journey, that love wasn't built on perfection, but on honest, vulnerable truth. Deep down, they both knew that love was already there, quiet, patient, waiting. It had been growing slowly, like a flower in winter, unexpected, fragile, but undeniably real. They just needed to allow it to bloom. And standing there in the warm glow of the cafe, with autumn leaves dancing past the windows and the promise of new beginnings hanging in the air between them, they finally gave themselves permission to hope, to heal, to love. 1 year later, Hazel's Corner Cafe had become more than just a place to get coffee. It had become a sanctuary, a place where people came not just for breakfast or lunch, but for something deeper, for kindness, for honesty, for the feeling that the world could still be good if you looked in the right places. The cafe had been beautifully restored. New paint brightened the walls, a warm cream color that made everything feel like sunshine. The old wooden tables had been refinished, their scratches and scars now part of their character rather than signs of wear. Fresh flowers sat on every table, changed daily, and through the large front windows, autumn light poured in, golden and gentle, making everything glow. But the soul of the place hadn't changed. It was still warm, still honest, still home. Hazel sat in her favorite corner, a basket of fabric beside her, sewing new tablecloths with the same patient smile she had always worn. Her hands moved slowly but surely, each stitch careful and deliberate. She hummed an old hymn under her breath, content in the knowledge that this place, this beautiful, honest place, would continue long after she was gone. She looked up and watched the morning unfold around her, and her heart swelled with gratitude. Eli moved between the tables with easy confidence, laughing loudly as he delivered a stack of pancakes to a family with 3 young children. "Extra chocolate chips for the birthday girl," he announced, setting the plate down with a flourish. The little girl squealed with delight, and her parents smiled at each other with the tired, grateful expressions of people who had found a place where their family was welcomed and celebrated. Eli had grown into his role as manager. He hired well. He treated his staff with respect and kindness. He remembered customers' names and their orders and asked about their lives. He had learned from Hazel and Nora that a cafe wasn't really about coffee at all. It was about connection, about making people feel seen, about serving hope alongside breakfast. And he loved every minute of it. Early each morning, before the cafe officially opened, Grant arrived. He parked his car down the street. Not the expensive luxury sedan anymore, but a simple, reliable vehicle that didn't announce his presence. He wore jeans and a comfortable sweater. He came through the back door with a cheerful "good morning" and immediately set to work. He opened the windows to let in fresh air. He arranged chairs. He wiped down tables. He helped Eli prep the kitchen. He did these things not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Because being here, working beside people he had grown to love, made him happier than any boardroom meeting ever had. He had sold most of his real estate empire, kept only what was necessary, given the rest away or liquidated it to continue making restitution. He lived simply now, modestly, and he had never felt richer in his life. Near the front door, a new sign had been hung just last week. Beautifully painted in gold letters against a dark green background, it read, "Hazel's Corner Cafe Proprietors, Hazel Moore, Nora Ellison, Grant Weller." Nora stood in front of that sign now, tracing her name with her fingertips. Her name, her real name, not hidden anymore, not erased, not forgotten. Written proudly on the door of a place she had helped build, not with lies or shortcuts or compromises, but with honesty and hard work and faith that doing right would eventually lead somewhere good. The past had not disappeared. It still existed. The pain, the loss, the years of suffering, they were all still part of her story, but they were no longer open wounds. They had become something else. Lessons, reminders, scars that proved she had survived. The villain of her story, Charles Denton, had disappeared after that meeting. Fled the country, some said. Others claimed he was living under an assumed name somewhere warm and anonymous. The legal system had tried to find him, to hold him accountable, but he had vanished like smoke. And strangely, Nora didn't mind. Because justice, she had learned, wasn't always about punishment. Sometimes justice was simply about truth being acknowledged, about the innocent being vindicated, about the record being set straight. Justice lived now in every kind word spoken in the cafe, in every honest transaction, in every person who walked through the door and was treated with dignity and respect. That was justice. The quiet, powerful kind that changed the world, one small moment at a time. Grant finished arranging the chairs and walked over to where Nora stood. He looked at the sign and smiled, a genuine, peaceful smile that transformed his entire face. "Beautiful," he said softly. "It is," Nora agreed. They stood there together for a moment, comfortable in the silence, in each other's presence. Over the past year they had grown close, not quickly, not dramatically, but slowly, carefully, like two people learning to trust again after betrayal. They had shared meals and conversations. They had worked side by side. They had laughed together and occasionally cried together. And somewhere along the way, friendship had deepened into something more. Something neither of them rushed or named, but both of them felt. Grant turned to her with an expression that was both playful and serious. "You know," he said, "I still want to pay for something." Nora raised an eyebrow. "What?" "The bill for forgiveness," Grant said quietly. Nora looked at him, her eyes suddenly bright with tears. She reached out and took his hand, the first time she had initiated such contact. His fingers closed around hers, warm and steady. "That bill," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion, "was already paid, Grant. With truth." Grant's eyes filled with tears. He nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Then he squeezed her hand gently. "Thank you," he whispered, "for giving me a second chance, for believing that people can change, for showing me what really matters." "We saved each other," Nora said simply. And it was true. She had saved him from a life of empty wealth and moral bankruptcy. And he had saved her from a life of hiding and bitterness. They had both been drowning in their own ways. And somehow, miraculously, they had found each other and learned to breathe again. The bell above the door chimed softly as the first customer of the morning walked in, an elderly gentleman with a newspaper tucked under his arm and a kind smile on his face. "Good morning," he called out cheerfully. "Good morning, Mr. Patterson," Eli responded from behind the counter. "The usual?" "You know me too well, young man." Laughter filled the cafe. The morning officially began, and with it came all the beautiful, ordinary moments that made up a life worth living. Outside, autumn had arrived in full force. The trees were ablaze with color, reds and golds and oranges that looked like fire against the blue sky. Leaves danced through the air, swirling and spinning before settling gently on the sidewalk. The air smelled of cinnamon and wood smoke, and the promise of change. The door opened again, and again. Customers flowed in, regulars and newcomers, young and old, rich and poor. All of them welcomed, all of them served with the same care and attention. Hazel looked up from her sewing and smiled at the beautiful chaos. Eli laughed as he juggled 3 orders at once. Grant poured coffee with the careful attention of someone who had finally learned that the smallest tasks, done with love, were the most important ones. And Nora stood in the middle of it all, surrounded by warmth and laughter, and the life she had rebuilt from ashes. She looked at Grant. He looked back at her, and in that shared glance was everything. Gratitude and hope and love and the quiet understanding that sometimes the best things in life are the ones you never planned for, the ones that find you when you're not looking, the ones that grow in the spaces between heartbreak and healing. The bell above the door chimed once more, and autumn walked in, bringing with it peace, coffee, and love, the kind of love that money could never buy, the kind that was earned through honesty, nurtured through forgiveness, and sustained by the simple, extraordinary decision to choose truth over comfort every single day. And as the morning light filled Hazel's Corner Cafe with gold, 3 words hung unspoken in the air, felt by everyone present. This is home. The end.